Hey guys, are you looking to build a SaaS? Well, you've come to the right place. In this series of episodes, we're going to take a look at how to build and publish a SaaS product. And I'm not just talking about building, okay? We're going to talk about hosting, database, file storage, authentication, stuff like that. But we're also going to talk about other things, lesser known things, like how to track your issues, how to handle logging, how to handle support, all those things that you need to know to start a SaaS business, to write a SaaS application. So in this video, we're going to start with hosting. Let's go. All right, so hosting. Now, hosting, it is likely that you're going to need both to host a front end and a back end, some kind of a back end, right? So we're going to go down both of these routes. We're going to look at the SPA, PWA route first. That's going to be the front end. And then we're going to look at the server. So the SPA stands for single page application, and PWA, progressive web application. They're essentially, conceptually, they're the same thing. There are some technical differences in the implementation where the PWA can be installed like a real application on your computer, whereas the SPA is entirely web-based, so it stays in your browser. But besides that, these are both relatively the same. So let's take a look at SPA first. So there are three options for building your front end. Now, when I say three, I actually mean there are probably hundreds, but there are really just three serious options, especially options that you're going to be hiring for. So there's also Remix and Solid and Alpine, but React, Vue, and Svelte are the three options that you're going to be looking at. So when you're building a front end, or when you're hiring for the front end position, one of these three technologies is going to be what you're going to be looking for, realistically. There's also Blazor, but we'll talk about Blazor a little bit later, but I would recommend to focus on these. Now, React has been around the longest, but Vue is, I would say, easier to pick up. So if you're hiring a developer that doesn't know either of these three, but they're good at JavaScript, they're going to be able to pick up Vue faster than they're going to be able to pick up React. We'll go into this into detail a bit more in the next section, but yeah, so Vue, a little easier to pick up, just as powerful as React, slightly smaller ecosystem, and React more popular in the United States, whereas Vue is also an open source framework. It's more popular around the world, I would say. And Svelte is a relative newcomer to this group, but it is rapidly growing. So yeah, but anyways, React, Vue, Svelte, those are the three frameworks you should be looking at when building a front end. And realistically, out of those, you should be probably using a meta framework. So while you can use React and then the router and then the store, right? And the Vue has its own router and store as a Svelte. You could do that. But there are meta frameworks, which are frameworks that are opinionated and have all of that stuff built in and more, including server rendering and server islands, stuff like that. They're much more powerful. So while, let's say, for example, you chose to go with Vue, if you went with Vue, you would probably actually want to be building using Nuxt 3 specifically. There's also, for React, the equivalent is Next, and for Svelte is SvelteKit. So these are kind of superset frameworks on top of the aforementioned React and Vue and Svelte libraries. There's also Blazor. Blazor is C# based, and so you write your code in C# and it quote unquote compiles down to WASM, WebAssembly. But WebAssembly doesn't have access to the DOM, meaning the browser, so it can't manipulate the browser, move elements around, change style, stuff like that. So you still need to use JavaScript for that. There's a way to interop with JavaScript, and it works, but it's kind of clunky. And to be perfectly honest, if you're building a front end first application, I honestly just stick to these three. Blazor's kind of good for very specific scenarios that you're probably not going to be building. But I would be happy to expand on the differences in another video if you're interested. So leave a comment if you would like to hear more about that. Coincidentally, I've been working with Blazor a ton over the last year at work. So I'm quite familiar with it now. But yeah, so let's just leave it at that. Blazor is also an option if you have a C# shop. But I would still recommend doing your UI in one of these three. Now, this section is about hosting, right? But we're just talking about front-end frameworks. Well, you got to host these frameworks somewhere. So finally, we've arrived to the last step. And the last step here is, where do you want to host these? Now, there are many providers. Do keep in mind that if you're using React, Vue, or Svelte, they're going to be compiling to basically just client-side JavaScript. And if you're using Next, SvelteKit, or some implementations of Blazor, they're going to be either compiled down to client or hosted on the server. And we'll touch on that in the server section. But that's kind of essentially what you're looking at. So if you do compile to client code, Next, Svelte, or Blazor, you can host these on Netlify, or Render, or Firebase, or AWS Amplify, and more. So these are just 4 options. There are many more. You could host on Azure Blob Storage, or inside an AWS S3 bucket. Yeah, so you could host it in a bunch of places. But these are just 4 options. Personally, if you were to ask my recommendation, all of my stuff is hosted on Render. All of my client code is hosted on Render. But I have used Firebase in the past. Also a very good option, very easy to use. There's also Supabase, which I didn't list here, but we'll talk about it in the server section. And AWS Amplify, also a good option. I mean, Netlify was like the OG of hosting your client code, so also still a good option. I would just do your research. Just Google like where to host my client-side application, and you'll probably get like a top list of top 20 or top 25 or something. You can go from there. I host my stuff on Render, not an advertisement, just it's kind of what I choose. Very easy to use. Firebase, also a great option. Okay, so we've covered hosting and we've covered the front end. Let's go back to the top and talk about the server. Now, the server is really anything that requires compute to, I don't know, dynamically render an HTML page or do some math calculation or something like that you want to happen on the server before the response is sent to the client. Anything you need, like database access or any secrets that you need to store, all of those things are going to be happening on the server, because anything in the client code is available to the client. So if you put any kind of secrets or anything in there, those are going to be downloaded in the client. So server, you're definitely going to have a server. Now there are options. Just like we have options here, we also have options here. These are just some options. You may be, for example, you may be building an API. For that, you may want to use Nest.js. Or you may be, for example, doing server-side rendering. Or you may want to just render plain HTML. You can use any of these frameworks listed here to do this. These are just, again, I think these are the most popular. These are just some examples. There are more. Like I didn't list, for example, ASP.NET MVC here. It's there, but I personally would just go with Blazor for that. Blazor 8, .NET 8 Blazor has that kind of supersedes MVC kind of in a way. But yeah, so you can do that. And there are these options here, Django, Python, obviously Laravel, PHP, Nuxt, Next, and SvelteKit we already covered previously. So these also have server components that you can do, that you can use. Blazor, again, it has multiple flavors. So you have your client-side Blazor, which is the WebAssembly. Then you have your server-side Blazor. And Blazor in .NET 8 has like multiple ways you can use it. So I listed here as well. Nest.js is very cool, JavaScript-based, like node-based framework, kind of a better Express, I would say, mostly for APIs. It has the MVC, uses the MVC model, similar to ASP.NET Core. Very cool, Nest.js. But it's mostly for APIs. And then HTMX, which is kind of a newcomer. It's a hot new thing nowadays. Everyone's talking about. People mostly use it with Golang. So it's an option. But if you're hiring, you're probably going to be looking at any of these over here. Probably HTMX is not something that's on anyone's radar right now. So these are some of the options for the frameworks you can use. And then where can you host them? Well, there are a few options. Let's zoom out a little bit. So first, these options are kind of easy to use, I would say. These are like easy to use options. So you have a GitHub repository, you check in your code, and a deploy script kicks off on one of these platforms, and then your code is magically deployed. You could have multiple environments, like development, staging, production, and everything is really quite easy to use. These are tier 2 cloud providers. So they build on top of, I don't know if Cloudflare does actually, but I know Render does, and so does Railway. They build on top of existing cloud infrastructure provided by AWS or GCP or Azure. So these are just easier to use cloud providers, but they are going to be more expensive. Not necessarily in the beginning. So if you're just starting out and you want to get your product out the door, using one of these is excellent. It is super mega fast productivity. You're able to build a product and get it out the door in like a month if you have a good developer. The reason for that is that you don't need a DevOps engineer. You don't need anyone to know how to use Docker, Kubernetes, or anything like that. You can just check in your code, hook it up to Railway, for example, and you're golden, right? You have a deployed service. You can deploy another service with another repository and then connect them together. It's just like building Lego. It's super easy, right? For these services. However, as your application grows, you'll start running into cost issues, specifically on the bandwidth side. So Vercel, for example, easy to get started, but like as you grow and you have more and more bandwidth being used up, you start paying significant amount of money. And that's just, as a business who's cost conscious, this is something that you want to keep in mind. So what are some of the other options? Let's say you started on Railway and you've deployed your application, but you're starting to see that, a $3,000 a month bill, and you're thinking, okay, maybe I want to slim down a little, or I want to reduce the cost. Well, maybe you're being less efficient than you'd like to be. Now, with some of these services, you can actually be very efficient, and you can optimize prior to moving off of these platforms. But if you are thinking that you want to hire a DevOps engineer and you want to maybe grow bigger, and you want to grow your team, and you want to kind of build a real bigger business, there are other options here. So you could have a Kubernetes cluster. This is something actually that I built in my previous job, which was not easy. Let's just put it that way. I had to learn like YAML, Helm charts, and had to learn how to use AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, micro K8s and stuff like that. So it was very involved. Kubernetes is very involved, but it's very, very powerful. If you're thinking about moving off of any of these platforms and you don't have a lot of services, where maybe you have one main service that you're hosting, the front end, and then you have like 5 or 10 backing services that you need to replicate, right? So you need to have multiple instances of one service. You can do that with Docker, just Docker, and Docker Compose, and you can spin up a whole system just using Docker Compose. It also supports replicas, just like Kubernetes, and it's a little less, I would say it's a little less powerful than Kubernetes. Not little, it's less powerful than Kubernetes, but it is vastly simpler than Kubernetes. You need like one file, Docker Compose, right? And then you're good. Whereas with Kubernetes, it starts to get a little more complicated. You need multiple Helm charts, you need ingress, YAML, all this other stuff. So Docker Compose, developers that you're perhaps hiring should still be able to use Docker. Everybody should be able to use Docker by now. It's been around for years. And you can host this on a VPS. Now, VPS is essentially like a virtual machine that you rent from AWS or Azure or GCP or DigitalOcean or Linode or wherever you're getting your VPS from. And you can do two things. First, you can install Docker, and then you can set up this Docker Compose chain that I discussed earlier, or you could install Nginx and self-host. Actually, even for Docker, you're still gonna need Nginx, but you could self-host on bare metal your code. This is something I would urge you not to do, but it is an option, and it's probably cost-wise, it's the cheapest option. Time-wise, it's the most expensive option. So, if you're just starting out, go with one of these, or there are more, not just these 4. These are just 4 I listed here. If you're just starting out, you want to get your product out the door, Vercel, Railway, Render, Cloudflare, great. Cloudflare pages. If you're growing bigger, let's say you have 15 employees, maybe 20, you're hiring a DevOps engineer, you have an HR department, maybe Kubernetes is something you could do. I would really never advise doing a VPS, bare metal VPS for a business. It's just so much work. And you have to update the operating system, right? You got to update, you got to get all the security patches and all this other stuff. It's a lot of work. So you can SSH into your VM and set up everything yourself, but honestly, don't do that. Just use one of these. They're cheap early on, and as you grow, you optimize your code. And if you really outgrow these platforms, which would be impressive. That means you're making a lot of money. You can move to Kubernetes, or you could also start with Docker Compose on a VPS, but it's a little more involved. So here we have it. We have the SPA, and this is the front end, and then this is the back end, or also the front end if you're using one of these. And this is where you can host the back end, and this is where you can host the front end. Next, let's take a look at some databases.